I'm David Schwartz, the practice group leader of Thompson Hine's International Trade Group. Welcome to our SmarTrade Fundamentals webinar. This is the fourth webinar in a 5-part series. Our last one will be on trade remedies 1 week from now on November 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Today, we'll be discussing U.S. trade policy, those legislative and executive branch actions that can influence and affect global trade relationships. With the return of the Trump administration in January, we will focus necessarily our discussion on what we can expect the next 4 years. I'm joined today by my International Trade Group colleagues, Ujczo and Kerem Bilge. Before we start, I must address a few housekeeping items. First, we are recording today's program, and we'll send a link to you within the next few days. Second, the PowerPoint presentation will also be sent to you after the presentation. Third, the presentation is intended for the general information of individuals and organizations on matters of current interest. The thoughts and opinions expressed today are those of the individual panel members only and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the panel members' clients, employers, affiliates, or Thompson Hine. The content should not be taken as advice, as the views expressed here are for informational purposes only. Fourth, if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to use the chat box located in the control panel on the right side of your screen to submit questions. We will answer as many of the questions as we can, both during the presentation and at the end of the webinar. If we don't get to your questions, we'll follow up with you after the program. Fifth, CLE credit for today's webinar is pending. Please be sure to complete the verification of attendance survey. The link to that survey is posted in the chat. We will also paste the link in the chat at the end of the program. I'll announce the attendance tracking code at the end of the program. Again, thank you for joining us, and let's get started. We have a jam-packed agenda covering a wide variety of trade policy topics. I'll be covering today who makes trade policy and the possible tariff increases during the second Trump administration. My colleague Kerem will be talking about the status of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and the pending de minimis legislation. And Dan will be covering a wide range of trade topics. He'll be discussing onshoring, nearshoring, and ally shoring. He'll be talking about the USMCA and its review in 2026. He'll also be talking about other potential free trade agreements, such as the US-UK Free Trade Agreement and the US-Kenya FTA. And Dan will be covering the alphabet soup of existing statutes, the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, the Chips and Science Act, Buy America Act, and the Buy America, Build America Act, and the status of those pieces of legislation during the second Trump administration. Let's discuss briefly now who makes U.S. trade policy. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress has the congressional authority to levy taxes and regulate foreign commerce. Under Article 2 of the Constitution, the executive negotiates treaties. Now, over the last 100 years, through various pieces of legislation, Congress has delegated much trade policy authority to the executive branch. Today, the executive branch still negotiates treaties, but it also issues regulations, prepares policy documents, and conducts various investigations under the statutory authority granted to it in the past 100 years by Congress. In the first Trump administration, we know that President-elect Trump used tariffs as leverage to encourage onshoring and to reduce trade deficits with our bilateral trade partners. We're all remembering how he would announce such policy changes by tweeting any hour of the day or night, and requiring various executive branch agencies to backfill his policy pronouncements with support from regulations and formal procedures. In the second Trump administration, we can expect not only more of the same, but more of everything. President-elect Trump has been clear when he was campaigning during leading up to the election that he tends to continue using tariffs as leverage in negotiations bilaterally, and he plans to use tariffs as offsets to planned tax cuts. On the next slide, we list the likely tools that the Trump administration will use. We have the IEEPA, which is the International Emergency Powers Act, and that was passed in 1977. We have Section 232, which was passed in 1962. We have Section 301 and Section 201, which was passed in 1974. And then we have two pieces of legislation, Section 122 and Section 338, that most of us are not familiar with because they haven't been used, if at all, in decades. And the reason why they're on this list as possible tariff tools available to the Trump administration is because Robert Lighthizer has referenced them in his writings. If you're not familiar with Robert Lighthizer, he was the USTR during the first Trump administration. And there's been talk that he will be appointed the trade czar in the second Trump administration. There had been talk that he might resume the USTR position and that he might become Secretary of Commerce, but lately the discussion has been focused on him taking over as a trade czar, overseeing trade matters throughout the executive branch. How do we expect President-elect Trump to use these tools in his second administration? There are a number of proposed actions that have already been floated during the campaign. There's already a bill that's been prepared to repeal China's permanent normal trade relations, and that would lead to an immediate increase, a significant increase in tariffs involving products imported from China. And that might get to what President-elect Trump has sought, an increase of anywhere from 60 to 100% on products imported from China. There has also been talk that Congress, as part of a tax bill, might embed in it tariff increases worldwide to cover imports from 10 to 20%. Originally, that had been discussed as an increase that would rely on IEEPA, but now there's talk that this worldwide tariff increase will be included in legislation because it'll make it difficult for any president following President-elect Trump from removing those increased tariffs. There's also talk about another Section 301 action against China, or building out and expanding the existing Section 301 that's already in place against China as a way to target increased tariffs against imports from the country. Also, President-elect Trump has mentioned that he's interested as leverage to use tariffs to force the Mexican government to take certain actions. There's been discussion that if Mexico doesn't cooperate on issues of migration, if it doesn't cooperate on slowing down the increase in onshoring of Chinese companies in Mexico, that the U.S. government might take action or retaliate or force, using tariffs, force Mexico to change its behavior by using tariffs as leverage. There's also the Section 201 option, which has been used in the past. And then, of course, there's IEEPA, which most people believe is the quickest way for President-elect Trump to implement tariffs worldwide. Now, Kerem will address the status of our forced labor policies.
Thanks, David. So yeah, today I'll discuss two separate but somehow related topics. And these are the forced labor UFLPA and the de minimis discussions that are happening right now in Washington. The forced labor, I'm sure many of you are already very familiar with forced labor and UFLPA, but just to give you a very quick background. So forced labor prohibition codified at 19 U.S.C. 1307 prohibits the importation of goods wholly or partially made using forced labor or convict or indentured labor. And CBP is the agency that is charged with enforcing this prohibition. In 2021, Congress passed UFLPA, which stands for Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which created a presumption that all goods produced wholly or in part in Xinjiang region of China or by companies that are listed on the UFLPA entity list are made with forced labor. What that means, if CBP suspects that a certain shipment at the border is covered by the UFLPA presumption, i.e. it's somehow connected to the Xinjiang region or to the entities listed on the UFLPA list, it can detain the products. And then if detained, the importer basically will have two options to get some sort of a relief. The importer can request like what they call the applicability review, which essentially means that it needs to provide information to CBP showing that the importation is outside the scope of the UFLPA, i.e. the imported goods or the inputs that go into the final goods are sourced from outside of Xinjiang or have no connection to entities on the UFLPA entity list. And failing that, the importer can try to rebut the presumption by showing with clear and convincing evidence that the supply chain of the imported product is free from forced labor, even though it contains inputs sourced from Xinjiang or from entities listed on the UFLPA list. But obviously, rebutting the presumption is very difficult, and it's a very high standard of proof. And if the importer cannot do either one, then the CBP will either re-export the shipment or destroy it. And in the last 4 years, CBP has focused its priorities to enforcement priorities to certain products. These include solar, silica-based products, PVC, cotton, and aluminum. What's next for this enforcement in the Trump administration? That's the main question for us right now. Well, I believe that the enforcement will likely continue in full force with the new Trump administration. There are various reasons for that. The first one is, well, it's a very bipartisan issue supported by both sides of Congress. And in fact, Marco Rubio, who is going to become the Secretary of State if approved in the next administration, was one of the sponsors of the bill that eventually became the UFLPA. So we can expect him to be a strong supporter of enforcement of this law in the next administration. And the second reason is that the UFLPA enforcement was really driven by by the Biden administration as well as by Congress in the last 4 years. In fact, the Senate Finance Committee was very actively involved in investigating the forced labor in auto supply chains, and even released a report, I believe, back in May of this year about their findings throughout their investigation. So all that to say is that the enforcement of forced labor and the UFLPA provision will likely continue and will likely increase in the next administration. And if I had to predict, I would expect that the new administration to expand the list, the UFLPA entity list, and the priority products for enforcement by the CBP. And the importers should be ready to answer any potential questions from the CBP regarding their supply chains going forward. And obviously this requires more visibility into their upstream suppliers, and even they should be ready to provide documentation showing that the supply chain does not really touch the Xinjiang region or the UFLPA entity list companies, or otherwise a UFLPA finding can be very obviously destructive for their supply chains. So the next topic I will discuss is the de minimis exemption. There have been a lot of talks in Washington in the last 5-6 months about this provision. The current rule is that shipments with an aggregate value of up to $800 per day per person can be imported free of duties and taxes, and with very minimal information, except products that are subject to AD and CVD orders. This provision, this exemption, is being used very increasingly in the last few years. Nearly 4 million de minimis shipments enter the United States every day, and these shipments account for a substantial share of U.S. e-commerce imports, and various Chinese companies like Temu is the leading source of these de minimis shipments, and both sides of Congress are really concerned about the de minimis shipments containing products violating various laws, including the UFLPA that we just discussed, the intellectual property rights and health and safety regulations, or even shipments that contain drugs like fentanyl, and there's a growing concern about this and a will to address this issue. In fact, recent statistics, I think released by CBP, show that 89% of all seizures made by the CBP in the last year originated as de minimis shipments, and it also 97% of all narcotics seizures were de minimis shipments. So there's a growing concern, and we expect the Biden administration to issue a proposed rule before the end of the year, and that the rule will probably address various aspects of the de minimis shipments to restrict the exemption. And our understanding is that, first of all, they will propose to exclude from the de minimis exemption all shipments containing products covered by Section 301 or 232 tariffs. And as you all know, Section 301 tariffs cover a large portion of the products coming from China, so that will have a huge impact on the trade flow from China. And also they will likely propose to require more information from de minimis entries, such as like the full 10-digit tariff classification and information about the person claiming the de minimis exemption. But it will be unlikely for the Biden administration to finalize the rule before January next year. So we would expect the Trump administration to either continue with that proposal or make some significant changes. But I do expect that this rule will become this proposal will become the rule sometime within the next year. And the congressional action will also be likely to follow. It's a bipartisan issue. It's worth noting that Trump administration did work on closing this loophole back in 2020, and there are some bills out there in Congress right now that address some other aspects of the de minimis exemption, like I think one of the bills proposes to prohibit the entry of import-sensitive products, which is a term defined by the GSP and includes various products like textiles and apparel goods. And another proposal is to charge a $2 per shipment fee for entries that are using the de minimis exemption. So yeah, in short, we should expect some action from both the next administration, the current administration, and the next administration about this de minimis exemption issue, and then we'll likely see congressional action next year addressing the shortcomings. So now I will turn it over to Dan to talk about the onshoring and nearshoring issues.
Thanks, Kerem. Thanks, David. And it's great to see in the attendee list so many longstanding friends. It's great to see you all, at least virtually, and then so many new friends as well. So look forward to talking more with you about these issues. As David said, we're already, a lot of us are back to the old days, if you will, of staring at Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it now, and among other social media platforms to see the rapid pace of developments. Now, David painted really what is the trillions and trillions of dollar question, which is the issues around tariffs. And we talked a bit about the tariffs that came in place during Trump 1.0, certainly the 201s, the 232s, national security steel and aluminum, and then the 301s, the China tariffs as they're known, and then the options for going forward. I would just say in that these were not in the prognostication business, but in terms of evaluating risk, I think if you're using T words like theory, threat, tactic, remember we all said that in 2016 too. And look at what happened. I think you really need to start thinking of the other letter of the alphabet, which starts with P, which is this is the philosophy of this administration is tariffs. In particular, the trade czar, or whatever position he will hold, Robert Lighthizer, firmly believes that a 10% or a flat tariff is a fairer way to do trade, because instead of, the dirty lawyers and lobbyists coming in and negotiating for various different tariff rates, that this would be a flat tariff that everybody would have to pay. And so it's also, we've already seen that in Trump 1.0 become policy. The politics, at least of now, are very good in this, saying as somebody that lives in the blue wall part of the country, which I think we have to at least call the purple wall part of the country now, if not light pink wall in various areas of where we are. The politics are still very strong in favor of, particularly in areas around China. And we'll see how that plays out, right? If there is an inflationary impact pretty quick, what happens? And David had laid out a number of the tools that we'll likely see. And then Kerem followed up. But I do think it's also staying with P is the purpose of this administration. They know they have 2 years to get this done, and it's the very real purpose is to rebalance trade in that manner. And so I think you will see this as something that is going to have a very practical impact on profit lines and on people as we move forward. And we do have to remember that we never really got to the consumer goods last time around in the tariffs. Those very last lists, the lists fours, we started nipping and tucking, and then of course, if there was an inflationary impact, it got rolled into the COVID supply chain inflation that we saw. And I think there is an argument out there that some of the inflation we've seen is because of the intermediate goods effect that people, but the consumer didn't really see that in a way that they would be with a 10%, at least arguably would see. And so then Kerem talked a bit about UFLPA in the sense that that is one of the most aggressive trade actions. It's not. It's something that when CBP says it is, you have to rebut it, as was noted. And then he talked about de minimis. And I think we're on the spectrum on that, and that strong enforcement, almost, we're going to call it that way and you prove us wrong. Or do we see some of the mechanisms that David talked about? And I do think one of the lessons from the last administration, with whatever title Robert Lighthizer will have, is he did maintain fidelity to the statutes themselves. Arguably, those were challenged in court and generally upheld. And so I think he will want any tariff actions and some of the issues we'll talk about now to withstand that scrutiny and follow those procedures. But as we've seen, as David explained, some of those procedures do not. And then, of course, consultations with Congress. And I'll talk a little bit more with Congress and their role in this, as we now know. At least now it looks like it is a three-way hold as of, I think it was this morning. The days are starting to run together here. So the two chambers of Congress and the executive branch are in Republican control, but the president keeps selecting people from the House to be in the Senate. So those numbers are moving around a little bit until we get some special elections done. So now very quickly turning, now that you have the external wall around the United States and how that will look, what was happening inside the wall. And of course, that really started with the USMCA, the US-Canada-Mexico agreement, now known as NAFTA, or excuse me, the new NAFTA, now known as USMCA. And that was the initial action that the administration took to really rebalance trade and promote onshoring, reshoring, nearshoring, ally shoring, friend shoring, whatever term that you want to use. And I think just as we've talked about this many times here at Thompson Hine, that USMCA was less about Canada and Mexico, and it was more about China back then, not allowing China-sourced goods to be transshipped through the back doors and enter, in particular, the automotive supply chain. And we'll talk more about that. And then as these issues went along and we changed administrations, we then added onto this. Oh, I should stop there before we transition. We did have the strengthening Buy America provisions. That happened in the Trump administration multiple times. It was announced, and really on the way out the door in January of 2021, President Trump made an announcement. And one of the first things President Biden did is actually increase the thresholds. And we'll take a look at those on Buy America. And then when the Infrastructure Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, came on board in the Biden administration, there was now what we call Build America, Buy America, BABA or BABA, depending on where you're from. And those provisions are in there. And so that was still part of that, still really trade, government procurement. And then, of course, we added the industrial policy provisions that came through the rest of the alphabet soup, as David described it, the Inflation Reduction Act, along with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and the CHIPS Act. So we'll look at all of those. And we have frequently talked about these with our clients and on these webinars as the stack. Because if I'm sitting there as a customs compliance officer or part of your procurement and sales team at a company, I have to look at, okay, am I compliant and meet the standards for USMCA in terms of originating in North America, which are different, unfortunately, than what it may be under BAA, Buy American with an N, or Buy America with no N, or BABA, right? Those are different standards. And so just because something is originating in North America doesn't necessarily mean it's originating in the United States for BABA. And the same would be for the domestic content provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act and by extension CHIPS. They're all different standards, and that can be very frustrating. In fact, one of the things that when we would talk to members of Congress or the executive branch was we got to align these up. That's one of the best ways you could make things more efficient and still achieve your policy and political objectives. But I don't think we're going to get there in the short term, candidly. But next slide, please. And then as we move now, USMCA, we've talked a lot about this over the years. USMCA, when we did the new NAFTA, we've used the model of a renovation. About 70% of the original USMCA just has a fresh coat of paint for the 21st century. And we've seen a lot of positive developments in that when we work with it day in, day out, there's a lot of good news in USMCA. Then we put on some new fixtures and appliances, added things like a digital chapter, et cetera, some things that, quite frankly, we haven't taken out for a spin. And then, of course, we knocked down some walls and put on some new structures, and most significant of which was the automotive rules of origin, where prior it was about 62.5% for a finished vehicle. Those are now up to 75% to achieve North American origination. And the reason for that was when people took a car apart before this all happened in USMCA, they found out it was closer to 44% and still claiming to be made in North America. So you amp it up to 75%, put some rules in there, as we've talked about many times, for the automotive rules in there, and then bootstrapped onto that what's called the Rapid Response Labor Enforcement Mechanism, where Mexico's domestic labor laws, which had passed through the Mexican statutory requirements, the Mexican Congress, et cetera, and were kind of sitting on the shelf, USMCA encouraged Mexico to deploy those, and that's been happening since 2020, if not before. And then when folks find violations, the U.S. will actually contact Mexico to enforce it. So Mexico's civil society can contact labor attaches at the U.S. embassies and consulate. They in turn will report back to the U.S. Department of Labor, and the U.S. government will now reach out to Mexico and ask them to enforce Mexico labor law. And so that has been happening. Indeed, that has been the most active part of USMCA from a government to government perspective. Now, as this has been going on, we do have to keep in mind that USMCA came into force in July of 2020, right in the middle of COVID. So even though it's been around for coming on almost 4.5 years now, it's still in its infancy stage, because we had restrained enforcement the first couple of years. The automotive sector in particular has ramped up, but a lot of companies are still playing catch up here. Now, USMCA had a provision in there called what was originally called the sunset clause, now a review process, which USMCA has a term. It's a 16-year term from July 1st of 2020 to June 30th of 2036, as you can see on the slides. And the provision was that there will be a joint review after 6 years. Why was 6 years picked when we were in the negotiations as the private sector? It's because everybody knew that there would be a new president by that time. Canada has elections scheduled for 2025, and in the parliamentary system, they can have an election tomorrow, call an election tomorrow if they want. It could happen. I don't think that'll be the case, but it could. And Mexico, which, as we know, just had its election, and now we have Presidente Sheinbaum in Mexico. And so the idea was the leaders wouldn't be there. Nobody really, that originally negotiated USMCA, nobody really planned for this contingency, right? Where the President Trump would have been there and then came back. And so there is a review. The language, admittedly, is a bit unclear. I think originally the U.S. proposed USMCA will terminate after 5 or 6 years, depending on which proposal you looked at. Now it has a 16-year term, and at year 6, the parties will engage in a joint review looking at the operation of agreement, review recommendations for action, and decide on appropriate actions. What really happens there also in the implementing legislation is at least 1 month before there'll be some notice to some recommendations prepared for Congress, and 270 days before July 1st, there will be a notice and comment period for the private sector in the United States, and 180 days USTR will report to Congress. So that's in our implementing legislation. So if you put this all out there, this should all start happening on the US side in the fall of 2025 is the bottom line. Now, President Trump, many of us were at the Detroit Economic Club during the campaign when he announced, I am going to, on day 1, announce a review of USMCA. Well, the review was already scheduled to happen. So I expect the question is the review going to be accelerated in some way? Will they start this process earlier? Canada has already done its consultations or is in the midst of those now. Mexico is doing the same. What we don't know is, as we lead up to this review, the steps that are involved as the 3 countries show up and say, you know what, we want to renew this for another 16 years. And that would magically happen. The question is, and what is highly likely to happen, is one of the countries, likely the United States, is going to say, we're not renewing this for another 16 years. We want to engage in a joint review. The question is, does joint review mean review and just say, hey, we've reviewed it and let's move on? Or at that point, do you start revising the agreement? Do you engage in further renovations of the agreement, or is there a full renegotiation of the agreement? And that's the wild card that's out there. Canada and Mexico in particular are saying this is a review, not a renegotiation. I think we're probably looking at somewhere between a revision and renovate. And so what is very unclear in the language of the text itself, the plain language of the agreement, is the idea is, and then it says, well, then you will hold a review every year until the end of the term. So let's say somebody shows up and says, we're not doing this, we don't agree to extend. We have these issues we want to resolve. Do you get the year until the next July to resolve those? Or do you get until the end of the 16 years, which would be 2036? So theoretically, you could raise your complaint and you have another 10 years to fix it. The reality is that creates a very unstable investment climate. And so we're going to see how that plays all out. I just flag in here, there are some telling. So do you have a 1-year time frame? Do you kick the can? There are some ongoing consultations required with Congress. So Congress has a role with this. And we can't forget that even though this review mechanism, and there will be a review, whether that's a revision or renovation or renegotiation. And I want to be clear, renegotiate doesn't mean we're opening up the entire agreement. Like, there's no desire to go back and do a lot of that 70% of the agreement. What we'll do is we'll talk about some very specific chapters, but there's always the option that we can rip it up at any time. There's a 6-month withdrawal clock. So any one of the 3 governments can say we're out, and it stays in force for the other 2 agreements, and that party's out upon 6-month notice. So the question is, remembering the negotiating style of the president-elect, I don't know if we call him the president or president-elect still. I don't, because you're always the president, right, to some degree. And USTR, like Robert Lighthizer, is they like to put maximum pressure off. So do we see we are going to launch this review and we're on a 6-month clock as well? So we'll see how that plays out in January. Next slide, please. And so moving rather quickly, I think we're going to see some real topics. One of the major issues right now, anybody that's followed, is the China investments into Mexico. There's been no country that benefited more than from the China tariffs than Mexico, followed right behind with Vietnam. And so there is a lot of talk about transshipment. The auto industry has been policing itself very hard. It's not so much China goods are coming into Mexico, just putting a sticker on and coming in. That's not what we're seeing. What we're seeing is China actually investing in places like Nuevo León and Monterrey in Mexico, and then complying with the rules of origin, and then moving in, for example, potentially electric vehicles into the U.S. market at a lower price as made in North America. There is no way the U.S. wants that to happen. You really can't ratchet up the rules of origin in USMCA because North American automakers are barely meeting those. So you would have to raise it for everybody, and the Chinese would probably meet that anyway. So what you have to do is you have to have a targeted activity at electric vehicles. And David talked about some of the tariffs. I think we will see something like foreign entities of concern that are used in some of the Inflation Reduction Act to really go after those investments in China so that EVs are not coming through anywhere into North America, frankly. We've just had a major issue, and that has been in USMCA, is steel and aluminum. David talked about the national security tariffs. There has been increased enforcement by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and that steel and aluminum coming from Mexico is actually coming from China through the steel service centers and potentially Korea. There has been a crackdown. There's also been an anti-dumping countervailing duty case, and actually there was just found on the aluminum side that there was no injury to the U.S. industry on aluminum coming from Mexico and some other countries as well. We will see the rationale behind that. I think it's December 9th. But that's something to keep an eye on steel and aluminum. That is where USTR Lighthizer and many of his proteges come from, is the steel industry. A lot of activity, so keep an eye on that. The automotive rules of origin, the U.S. had an interesting interpretation of the rules of origin for the automotive sector, which said when we're using the real big parts, what we call core parts, they had to be a certain percentage, a very high percentage. When you get the components and you do the math and all the little components that go into that big part, but once we do those tests, all those strict tests, we say, okay, let's say it's 75, 76% made in North America and 24% made from everywhere else outside of North America. At that point, we could say it meets the rule, it follows all these other tests, et cetera, et cetera. At that point forward, it becomes 100% citizen of North America. And then when it's combined and assembled, you only count that down the road. That's how we've always done it. It's called roll-up. What the U.S. has now said in the automotive, no, we didn't mean that. We meant for these big parts, if it was 76 and 24, you have to continue to track that 74 and 24 through the supply chain. So when the automaker says I have to be at 75%, they're adding up all those columns that were 24, all the outside stuff. That's not how we did it for years. We used to just count that all as 100%. And so the US and Canada have disputed that, or excuse me, Mexico and Canada have disputed that with the United States. It's basically, it was decided against the United States interpretation, and the US is just kind of sitting on it and holding that for this review. There will be a number of agricultural disputes, GMO corn with Mexico, dairy with Canada. Right now, 67, just as a fun fact, 67 of the 72 counties in Wisconsin, a state that the president just won by 0.86%. 67 of those 72 counties are dairy producing counties, and all but 2 of those counties voted for President Trump by 65% or more. Dairy is going to be an important discussion with Canada and Canada's supply chain. Mexico's energy policy, Canada's digital services tax, Canada just put on, and rapid response labor mechanism. So keep in mind too, as much as President Trump said, oh, go ahead, please, Kerem. As much as President Trump and USTR Lighthizer are talking about the USMCA review, we can't forget that the president of the UAW said USMCA is the worst deal that we've had. I'm paraphrasing, but it was along those lines. So labor will be actively involved. I would just say on our wish list is keep in mind when we negotiated USMCA, every chapter has a committee. So they should be meeting all the time and working these things out so we don't have to wait for a review. Those really haven't wrapped up. There's a lot of discussion around regulatory good practices, reducing regulations between the 3 countries. There is a regulatory chapter in there. We have the example of the Canada-US Regulatory Cooperation Council. You can see digital trade, AI, talking about workforce, temporary entry. These are the things that business actually needs in North America. And these may be good topics of discussion, not so much in the review, but for the new DOGE, chaired by Elon Musk and my fellow Columbus native here, Vivek Ramaswamy, who are now leading that government red tape reduction. I want to move at the quick step here. Please, if you have any questions, enter those in the chat. But, we have to remember when it comes to USMCA, this is still the president's deal. It passed by large margins in the House and Senate. But I do flag, and this applies for a lot of these trade issues, about 200 members of the 435 members of the House weren't there last time around. And the Republicans that are in are more Trump Republicans than there were last time. So just keep that in mind as we talk about congressional. Where you really find, when people say the old Republicans, the George Bush, Herbert Walker, Ronald Reagan, that's really in the Senate. We saw that play out yesterday. So Congress will have a say, labor's role in this, but I do want to point out there is no trade promotion authority. TPA, fast track, as it's known. So if there are any changes to the USMCA and the U.S. executive branch takes a hard position and it potentially could blow up the deal, it still has to get approved by Congress, and there's no fast track. And so that applies as well. David talked at the outset that we were going to talk about a little bit of other free trade deals, US, UK. The Trump administration was working on a deal with the United Kingdom. At the end of the administration, US, Kenya, other EU initiatives. Without fast track, I don't see any of those happening, because the last thing in the world that Democrats will want to give in a very narrow margin House is the president a win on trade. So I think what you would have to see is probably a debate around TPA. So I'm just not confident we will see any other trade agreements happening. I also think there's the fundamental reality of bandwidth. The president's going to have to spend the first 100 days getting his cabinet confirmed, as Kerem said, and David touched on. They're going to have to launch that immigration policy, the deportation initiative. There's just not going to be a heck of a lot of bandwidth. And the tariff issues, USMCA, I just don't see a lot of FTAs early on in the first 2 years here. And, the WTO is just stuck in neutral with the appellate body. So I don't see a lot of these macro. I always get the question, do you think we'll see the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now known as the CPTPP? No, it's just not going to happen, in my opinion. Next slide, please. So now turning in the last 5-7 minutes or so to the Inflation Reduction Act. We here in Ohio, 2 days after the election, we're kind of ground zero for so much of this. We were not a battleground state presidential because we were the last 2 cycles. This is where this all started, is here in Ohio. Many of the people that are advising this campaign are Ohioans. 2 days after the election, we just had the most expensive non-presidential race in U.S. history, our U.S. Senate race, where the incumbent Sherrod Brown, the Democrat, lost to now U.S. Senator-elect Bernie Moreno. $500 million was spent on that race, the most expensive race. So everybody was here auditioning on the Thursday after the election. So we had Senator Moreno, we had Vivek Ramaswamy. Everybody was here looking for their position, and our governor is going to appoint the next senator to replace the vice president-elect, J.D. Vance. And I can tell you, every single one of the speakers came out of their mouth and said, we are removing the EV mandate. So that should give some breathing room to the automotive sector, to lengthen the timelines that they have to really deploy, because quite frankly, it's been a bumpy path on the rollout of EVs. I'm not suggesting in any way we won't see EVs, but I think the actual mandate to meet certain dates is likely gone. The question is, are those subsidies that also support EVs? And, that's where there's this interesting piece with Elon Musk and Tesla. I think a lot of folks believe that there is a path that if you remove those subsidies, the company that is farthest or furthest ahead in development is Tesla. So maybe they would have an advantage and that would keep the others down. That's known as path 1. Path 2 is what you kind of keep those subsidies for the consumers. If not, I just don't know where we're going to be on EVs. EVs will be a reality. The auto sector has completely retooled for that. I think it's more of a timing and tempo piece and what the subsidies look like, but we can't ignore of the money that's been deployed in the IRA, about over $200 billion, about 80% of it is EV related. We always laugh because it says, oh, those are in the Republican districts, that won't roll back. Well, just as a political guy, if your way to win back the working class was the Inflation Reduction Act, and working class voters, you think you'd want to put those in those districts. So that may explain why the Democrats lost. But I actually think it's a bit more than that. It's actually, you don't look at the districts, look at the states. Funny that list. The biggest projects are in North Carolina, Georgia, that state up north that has the city of Detroit, Nevada, Arizona. Where have I heard those states recently? So the IRA is a political tool, and the presumptive Speaker of the House just recently said we will use a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, to the Inflation Reduction Act. I think what we'll see, next slide please, is likely in the IRA. There's a flurry of U.S. Treasury activity that happened before the election. There's still some rules that have to be defined. I don't think we'll see a repeal. It will likely be revised to expand coverage to other clean energy projects. Coal continues to come up on that day. 2 days after, everybody auditioning for a job said, if you're going to burn coal, we're going to burn it in North America because it's the cleanest coal we have. I think you're going to see IRA evolve and amended to include natural gas. And I think what you'll likely see, and I think this will be the same on chips, the projects that are out there will continue to get their credits and not, but there will likely be some rollback on new projects. And again, as I said before, we do have to get this alignment done on domestic content and credit and what's U.S. originating. And I've talked already about foreign entity of concern. Next slide, please. And then quickly, chips, as I just said, look, I don't want to speak about specific projects, but there's one in particular in my neck of the woods waiting on about $24 billion. And the call from members of Congress is we don't like chips, but get the money out the door as fast as you can. We're hearing by Thanksgiving or Christmas is what the buzzword is. So some of the major semiconductor projects that are out there, but we're talking about not repeal, probably a revision to chips and the funding mechanism, which could work in a sense that I don't want to speak for the industry by any stretch of the imagination, and I refer you to David's disclaimer at the beginning. But with chips, you basically have the big fab plants, what we would call the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers in the auto. Those are being funded presently through this round. What you may see is less of direct funding going out and more tax credits going out to the supplier base, right? So you already have the anchors. Now we don't necessarily need to write checks to the suppliers because they'll follow along to get the business. But we'll see how that works out, because one of the things the Trump administration has to deal with is inflation. If you're going to do tariffs, if you're going to do immigration, there's going to be an inflationary impact. So you have to cut spending, arguably, and not run into a deflation. But that you would likely want to do that with giving credits, not direct payments, as they did in CHIPS. Last couple of slides here. I don't want to forget about our beautiful Buy America Act, Buy American, and BABA. I'll focus mostly Buy American, just for any confusion. Buy American is when the federal government is directly procuring and purchasing the good, usually through GSA, through the Department of Defense, and a handful of other agencies. As I said earlier, right now, 65% of that product using our tests has to be domestic content. That'll be 75 by 2029. And anytime you're using steel, if steel and iron and aluminum appear on your BOM, you better take a hard look at your bill of materials. Now, every agency has Buy America. Every agency had exemptions to get around it over the years. BABA was created to correct that, Build America, Buy America. So now all iron and steel used in infrastructure projects has to be melted and poured. So that means you can't get the steel from Russia or China or other places. And construction materials need to be 100% made in the U.S. And so that's the materials actually used in the construction itself. And you got into this absurd thing, is the paint used on a project? I understand that has to be 100% made here, but what about the can the paint comes in? And so there's been all kinds of clarifications. But where we really run into it the most is on manufactured products. You're selling something to the federal government that's now in an infrastructure project, in a university, a school, et cetera, et cetera. 55% of that cost of components needs to be made in the United States, and the final manufacturing step has to be in the United States. So a lot of overseas suppliers run into problems with that second step, because they used to be able to reach the thresholds, if not. And now I do just add on the next slide, Kerem, is a lot of overseas suppliers that may have been supplying you, or if you're overseas, use the World Trade Agreement Government Procurement Agreement as an exemption. That's usually a line in the government contract. That doesn't apply to most federal funding right now because of the way that those grants are given. I would just add the future of the Made in America office that President Biden launched early on, where all of the waivers to Buy America are being consolidated and agencies have to report. Will that still exist? It seems very consistent with the policy and the politics, and I'm just being a little corny here and saying Made in America office may be the Make America Great Again office or something like that. But I could see some kind of coordinating agency, because a lot of time is, and we're gonna, I think, just have to see another infrastructure. I think I lost track at week 11 infrastructure week we had during Trump 1.0. I think we had infrastructure week 11 times, at least in that first term. So I think we'll see, if we start seeing things get hectic, the way you solve the problem is we're launching infrastructure because we're going to build big, beautiful things. And, you know, I really think trade policy, everything that we've talked about, is going to be coordinated with tax cuts. Whenever the question comes up to folks that are joining this administration, new members of Congress, the Senate, et cetera, what's their answer for how they're going to do all of this and still keep inflation down or reduce inflation? Is we're going to increase supply of everything, increase supply of oil, nat gas, coal, all of the things that I talked about. We're going to have more food. We're going to have more of everything. And you have to be able to do that. But this is a complete transformation of global supply chain. So I'll just end in saying on the next slide, what are the things that companies should be doing here? I've already used this line. So again, just a refresh, this ain't threats and tactics. This is actually what they're going to do. It's just a question of the timing and tempo of all of it. And then what should we all be looking at as a set of companies on the next slide here, Kerem. So what should you be doing right now if you haven't done? Know your products from top to bottom. Your bill of materials should have all of the normal costing information, but HTS US codes, if you don't know what those are, let's talk about it. That's how those goods, but we don't only need to know what you're doing, country of origin, but your supplier, get back into that chain and take a deep dive into sourcing. And so many of our companies have done that in the wake of everything that David and Kerem have talked about. But you're going to need to know that, because we are going to have to be very nimble and react quickly to these changes. And I would just say, Kerem and I are both transportation lawyers. Review those contracts and supply chain lawyers, review those contracts for Incoterms. Look, if you're shipping stuff FOB and FCA, you better look at it right now and start looking for delivered duty paid as things. And it's going to be tough to negotiate to get that. Get your transportation providers under MSAs, because this could get kind of COVID ugly out here. And then clearly address in your contracts if things are sitting in ports of entry and detained, and who's paying for those costs. So make sure those are things that you can do right now to help buttress yourself, along with keeping with our SmarTrade programs and our blog, which of course is free. It's real-time information that we're providing to our clients, because again, things are going to move very, very fast in the first 100 days. So with that, I'll stop there. I think we do have some current questions in the chat, and we'll turn it over back to you, David and Kerem. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. We do have a handful of questions that we're going to address. It's probably going to take us past the top of the hour, so we invite you to stick with us at the top of the hour. However, I will provide you the tracking code for CLE, but we're going to try to knock out every single question that's been placed in the chat box. The first question we're going to start with is for Kerem. The question is, which countries are known to use forced labor besides China?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So the UFLPA, as I've explained, only applies to products that have some sort of a connection to the Xinjiang region of China, right? But obviously, the forced labor provision, the enforcement of the forced labor provision, is not limited to UFLPA. It has more than that, and CBP issues like withholding release orders, where it addresses like various products and countries or even regions, and makes a determination that those shipments that fall under the WROs are made with forced labor. For example, the like sugar made in Dominican Republic by certain entities have a specific WRO, meaning that the U.S. government has determined that the sugar made by those countries is made by those entities in Dominican Republic is made with forced labor, or there's like another WRO against an Indian company who sells cigarettes. So that the product, the cigarettes that are coming from that company would presumably be made by forced labor. But I mean, CBP has a list of these WROs on its website, and I'll be happy to take it offline if you have any specific questions about how the forced labor provisions are applied against different countries.
Thank you, Kerem. The next question is for Dan. If the USMCA is in fact sunsetted in 2026, how quickly will it be eliminated after the July 1st, 2025 review date, 2026 review date?
Yeah, well, the term right now is to 2036, so it would continue. That gets into that kick the can. But if one of the countries at any time, it could be today, launched the 6-month withdrawal notice, it's 6 months from now. And so you could envision a scenario where we start the review, the U.S. is not very happy with how it's going and says, you know what, you're not agreeing to our position, you're on the clock for 6 months. And it would be that the U.S. would be out of it 6 months later. Now, practically, that's the legal definition. Practically, how to detangle that, it could take a lifetime, frankly. You know, that's why, you know, blowing up USMCA likely is something to be avoided at all costs, particularly for our automotive sector and many other products. We are a North American supply chain. So, but to the question is, and let's say you get to the end after that review in year one, you can't reach a result, you still have till 2036 every year to do a review and to keep kicking. But at some point, the idea is that you're either going to reach a resolution or somebody's going to say we're done, and you're on the 6-month clock.
Thank you, Dan. Before we get to the next question, we've reached the top of the hour, and I promised you I'd give the CLE tracking code information. The CLE for today's program is TH4254. Again, the code for today's webinar is TH4254. The next question we have has to do with the reactivation of the generalized system of preferences. For those who aren't familiar with the GSP, that provides duty-free preferences for products from developing and least developed countries. I'll go ahead and field this one, and guys, if you have responses, feel free to jump in. I just think because we're faced going forward with a climate where we're trying to increase tariffs around the world and encourage onshoring of manufacturing here in the United States, I don't see a path forward for the renewal of GSP during the second Trump administration.
I agree.
All right, next question is from Marilee, and this is for Dan. Is Canada allowing roll-up of U.S.-made auto exports? Are fewer Mexican-made autos qualifying for USMCA benefits because they can't get to 75% without roll-up?
Well, right now, roll-up is the law of the land, arguably. It's how at least 2 of the 3 countries interpret the deal. The panel decided that way. So when companies are certified, keep in mind at the end of the day, that companies are certifying their own compliance, right? So they are sending the vehicles with their certificates of origin, and they are certifying it, use the rules that each automaker has decided is what they believe is their interpretation of the agreement and their exercise of reasonable care. So as of now, those companies are moving across the border. And so I think it's not a question of is Canada allowing it. Those companies are certifying that those companies that made the rule in accordance with their exercise of reasonable care as to the interpretation of the rule. Now, I don't think Mexico, we have seen a significant increase as reported by USTR in companies, automakers and auto parts companies not using USMCA tariff-free and using 2.5, just paying 2.5% that they would pay. And some of that is, I don't think it's really necessarily tied to roll-up. I think it's just more they're having a harder time get to however they're getting to those rules. They just know they're not going to make it, and or they don't want to go. I think it's also a function of they don't want to go through the administrative hassle of compliance and will pay 2.5%, which may be why a 10% tariff comes into play, right? You see those types of things as well, and so I think that's a lot of what's going on out there. But to the first question, I'll just end here and saying, the companies are certifying based on their interpretations of the rules in their exercise of reasonable care. And, it's whether the customs authority in each of the 3 countries are going to accept that and or subject that to verifications.
Thank you, Dan. We have a couple of other questions that I want to tee up before we close the presentation. This question asks, how soon can we expect tariff increases at the start of the second Trump administration? I think based on what we've seen with appointments with President-elect Trump, that we can expect to see an executive order ready to go within the first day or at least the first week, announcing probably through the use of IEEPA tariff increases. Guys, what do you think?
I concur with that. Certainly on the China side, I think China, you could ratchet back up very quickly on the grounds that China has not met its commitments under the deal that the Trump administration made. So you could see that ramping up. David talked about some of the mechanisms. I wonder if the 10% may get rolled into a tax package which will likely be one of the early things, but I think it will likely be announced. And that's something very important for our importing community to understand. The announcements themselves are already having an impact, right? In terms of your container cost, your freight cost. Kerem and I are seeing this nonstop. The aggressiveness with which your freight forwarders and other third-party logistics providers may be pricing. It's not yet COVID-esque in terms of pricing, but it's getting pretty close as we're moving in those directions. And I think that will only get worse. So there will be an impact even before these take effect, just in terms of your bottom line. And that's why we're saying start looking at those MSAs, your master transportation service agreements, if you haven't already, those INCO terms, et cetera, because it will. I know a lot of companies are getting boats on the water, getting goods on the boats in the water as fast as they can to get over here. And so we're already seeing that right now.
I have one more question to pose to the panel. Bob Lighthizer, who has been discussed as a possible trade czar in the second Trump administration and the former USTR during the first Trump administration, believes in a global rules-based system. He said that repeatedly, but he strongly opposes dispute settlement at the WTO. Do you think the U.S. during the second Trump administration will move to eliminate dispute settlement at the WTO entirely?
I do not. I think there will be ongoing discussions on that. I don't think it will be eliminated. I just think it will be significantly revised to make sure. He has called it the worst thing that I believe he's also called the WTO appellate system the worst thing that the U.S. ever agreed to. But I think there will be some system. USTR Lighthizer seems pretty happy with, or whatever position he'll hold, with review, so long as Americans are in charge of that review. So I think that's so. We'll see how the rest of the world feels about that system.
Great, thank you. I think we'll end the program here. I want to thank those of you who have remained for your interest and for attending today's webinar. Remember to check the chat box again for the link to the attendance survey if you are requesting CLE. Please also fill out the optional feedback form. The link to the form is also provided in the chat box. We hope that you'll join us for the final session of our 5-part SmarTrade Fundamentals series on November 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. That session again will address trade remedies. If you're not currently receiving our updates and invitations, please go to the Thompson Hine website and register to receive our mailings under the Publications tab. I also encourage you to visit our blog at thompsonhinesmarttrade.com. SmartTrade has one T in the middle. Thanks again for your interest in attending today's webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day.